In our last video, we addressed the question, what is critical thinking? We said that critical thinking was an activity as well as a skill, and that our focus would be on these 4 types of activities. In this video, we're going to focus in on arguments. And we're going to start just by asking what an argument is in the context of critical thinking. So let's start by defining the term. According to your book, an argument is a set of sentences consisting of an assertion to be supported and the verbal evidence for that assertion. When we support some sentence by offering verbal evidence for it, we are arguing for that sentence. Another way of putting the same point, an argument is a set of sentences related in such a way that some of the sentences are presented as evidence for another sentence in the set. Alright, so there's a number of important things to note here. First of all, an argument is a set of sentences. So what is an argument comprised of? It's comprised of sentences. And these sentences come in 2 types. The first type is an assertion to be supported, i.e. a claim that's put forward as true and in need of backing up. And then the rest of the sentences are the verbal evidence for that assertion. That is, the stuff being put forward in order to support the assertion being made. Now, if that all sounds a little too abstract, it'll probably be clearer if we look at an example. So take this little argument here. Cigarette smoking is a serious health hazard. Statistical studies show that cigarette smokers are not only at much greater risk for contracting lung cancer, but also have higher incidences of emphysema and heart disease. Okay, so is this a set of sentences? Yes. So this meets that criteria. Now, do we have the 2 right types of sentences included in the set? Well, let's take a look at this first sentence. Cigarette smoking is a serious health hazard. This is an assertion being put forward. It's a claim being put forward as true, and it's a claim that we're going to support. It's the support offered for the claim. These are considerations being put forward as evidence that this is true. So we've got both types of sentences here, and yep, this sure enough is indeed an argument. Now, we have names for these 2 types of sentences found in an argument. A statement in an argument that is put forth as evidence, put forth as something offered in support of the assertion, that's called a premise. It can be spelled this way or this way, but our book spells it this way, so that's what I'm going to use. And then the sentence in the argument that is being argued for, that's called the conclusion. Arguments may have more than one premise, but they're only going to have one conclusion. So, with that in mind, we can define arguments this way. A sequence of sentences in which one sentence, the conclusion, is marked off as being supported by the other sentences, the premises. It should be perhaps obvious, but maybe worth pointing out, that in this context, by an argument, we don't mean a mere dispute or disagreement. We mean a sequence of sentences in which one sentence, the conclusion, is marked off as being supported by the other sentences, the premises. Now, we're going to be working with arguments a lot, and it's going to be useful to have a certain way of organizing the information in an argument. We call this the standard form. And when an argument is in standard form, it looks like this. Each premise is put on its own line, then we've got a solid line after all the premises, and then the conclusion is put down below the line. So, if we take the last argument we had and put it into standard form, it's going to look like this. Here I treated the claim about contracting lung cancer as one premise, and the claims about emphysema and heart disease as another. So understand this way, we get a first premise on its own line, a second premise on its own, then this solid line, and then underneath it is our conclusion. So that's the argument put in standard form. Let's try another little example. Tia has a twin sister. Therefore, Tia is not an only child. What we've got here is a little one premise argument. Tia has a twin sister. This is our one premise, and it's being offered in support of our conclusion, namely that Tia is not an only child. So if we're going to put the argument into standard form, it's going to look like this. our premise, Tia has a twin sister, followed by the solid line, followed by our conclusion. Therefore, Tia is not an only child. Usually, the point of an argument is to support the truth of its conclusion. Demonstrating the truth of a conclusion requires both the truth of all the premises and, 2, the right type of support by the premises for the conclusion. If we look back at this little example about Tia not being an only child, we can see both of these things are true. Take, for example, this related argument. Taj has a twin sister, therefore Taj is not an only child. Well, if Taj did have a twin sister, then it would certainly be true that Taj is not an only child. This would follow from this. However, this is not true. Taj doesn't have a twin sister, and that makes this a bad argument because the premise is false. Take a look at this guy. Tia has a son. Therefore, Tia is not an only child. This time, our premise is true. Tia does have a son, this little guy. The problem is, this isn't the right sort of claim to support this conclusion. You can have a son and still be an only child. Take, for example, Frank Sinatra. He's got 3 kids, including a son, Frank Sinatra Jr. If we look at this argument, Frank has a son, therefore Frank is not an only child, we can see it's got to be bad. Because even though this premise is true, the conclusion doesn't follow. This is not the right sort of support for this claim. Something else to notice about arguments. Premises and conclusions of arguments are usually declarative sentences, which present information and make assertions. Declarative sentences, unlike ordinary questions and commands, can be either true or false. Okay, so think about why it would be the case that you'd want declarative sentences, things that can be true or false, as premises and conclusions, rather than something like a command. So look at this argument. Shut the door! Therefore, Frank is not an only child. This clearly doesn't make any sense. Shut the door. It's a command. It can't be true or false, and clearly this command cannot support or provide evidence for this conclusion. So that's why we're typically going to have declarative sentences. An exception is going to be, however, when you occasionally get rhetorical questions that can serve as a premise or conclusion for an argument. And the reason this happens sometimes is because those rhetorical questions are basically functioning more or less like an assertion in practice. So let's try an example where that's the case. So here we have an excerpt from an editorial page in the New York Times, and it reads, "Does anyone in the military believe that a cold-blooded terrorist who has withstood months of physical and psychological abuse will crack because a woman runs her fingers through his hair suggestively or watches him disrobe? If devout Muslims become terrorists because they believe Western civilization is depraved, does it make sense to try to unnerve them by having Western women behave like trollops?" So before we examine how exactly questions are playing a role in the presentation of this argument, now's a good time to make a caveat, namely this. Throughout this course, you're going to run across a lot of different arguments, some of which you'll probably agree with and others which you'll disagree with. It's important to note that just because the book uses an argument, that doesn't mean the author endorses the argument as a good one. Same for me. If I'm using an example of an argument, doesn't mean I'm endorsing it per se. Really what we want to focus on is building your critical thinking skills, and this can be done with arguments that you agree with the conclusion and when you disagree, arguments when you think they're done well or when they're done poorly. So that's our focus here. All right, but with that little bit aside, let's look at what's going on here. So we've got 2 questions. Initially, it might seem like there's not any premises nor conclusion here. But what you notice is really what the conclusion is that it does not make sense to try to unnerve terrorists by having Western women behave like trollops. This is the point that the author of the editorial is trying to get across. That's what the author is trying to support with verbal evidence. And what is the verbal evidence? The verbal evidence is the fact that the author thinks if we look at this question, our answer is going to be no. These terrorists won't crack if these women do these things, if they haven't otherwise. Thus, it really doesn't make sense to try to unnerve them by doing these things. So really what we have is we've got our conclusion. It doesn't make sense to try to unnerve terrorists by having Western women behave like dollops. And then we've got our premises, namely that the reason why we might think it'd be good for Western women to behave like this with the terrorist suspects is not a good reason because it's not going to be successful. So that's how rhetorical questions could be used to construct an argument. You may have some other questions at this point, such as, is this really all the information right in front of us? We were sort of looking at implications here. Or you might think, gee, how would I put this in standard form? If you've got questions like that, great. That's some of the stuff we're going to be talking about in the videos ahead. But for the time being, that's all we've got for here. So until next time.